Just to follow that up, really, in the unlikely event that this present government are able to stabilise the banking system, do we really want to continue with this type of banking system? Do we want something else? Do we want the banking system to be controlled by the people, I should say, by the government, or should it be in private hands? Because I don't want to go back to what we've just been through. I do not want to see the level of suffering that is developing in society recreated time and time again. It's got to be the end for that type of banking, that type of privatisation, that kind of way of running society.
Okay. Douglas Murray.
Well, I mean, bankers are people too. And the banking industry has undoubtedly had people in it who have disgraced that industry. But I would like to warn you a little bit about this, as it were, because it's very much in government's interest, this government's interest, to personalise this issue onto one sector, one group of people, indeed on occasions one individual, and to blame an individual, at the same time to blame a global downturn. Who is it that's missing between these two things? It's our government. It's the UK government that still takes no responsibility for this. Before the 2005 election, they could have checked personal debt, but they didn't. They were too keen to get back into office, and we're paying for that now. Tessa Jowell mentioned the 1.3 billion that you're spending on Job Centre Plus. But just go on to the other side of this. Look at the waste this government is engaging in. The waste, 1.3 billion for Job Centre Plus. In the last few years since the last election, this government has spent 1 billion, just less than that, on advertising. This is monumental waste, and they don't have to do it. And people should be a lot angrier than they are about the waste that this government has been making of their money.
I was just wondering if the panel think that it would have been cheaper to make every mortgage in the UK variable for a period of time. This would have allowed domestically across the country to have free up lots of cash to spend in the right places.
There are more imaginative things that could have been done.
I think so, yeah. It could have been more direct into UK family homes to get money out of the roof into the system.
Fern, Britton?
Yeah, I think the domestic issue is interesting, and also the gentleman there thought perhaps we should run the banks if no one else can, because it seems to the majority of people that we who have families and houses and mortgages and all of those things, we knew that spending was too much. We knew that credit was being offered willy-nilly. We knew that money was suddenly very cheap to borrow, and a lot of people got themselves into problems even when it was that cheap to borrow. And I'm going to be very sexist here, but it appears that an awful lot of men have been in on this money business, and they've made a very bad fist of it. If there were some women doing some old-fashioned housekeeping, I can take it. If there was the old-fashioned housekeeping where, and women, traditionally anyway, are pretty good at making sure that the money goes in the pot for the electricity and the gas and the phone and the whatever, the food. We didn't pillage and rob it and stick it all on a horse to see if the money would come in next week, which it clearly hasn't when we put all that money into the banks, and as you said, Vince, we see nothing coming back. So I think we've got to stop looking at what's happening now and what happened in the future, and really start to put some safety barriers in place for 6 months down the road, which is looking after people, and as families we want to say, we need to save our money, we need to cut back on our luxuries and our treats, we need to share our money with our family and our friends, and not go mad. The government tell us, you've got to go out on the high street spending. It doesn't work that way, it doesn't equate.
Right. Women are quite good at that bit.
So you should have been in charge, Tessa Jowell, because you're a woman and you know how these...
Exactly.
I mean, did you think this was all going to happen? Are you apologetic on behalf of the government for the fact that they didn't spot what Fern Britton spotted and says everybody else spotted?
Well, Vince wrote, and I read at the beginning of the week, what I thought was a very interesting piece about this, where he quoted an Arabic scholar who said, people who claim to have foresight and predict the future are generally lying. And so I think that there's a lot about the reflection on this crisis, which borrows on hindsight. Of course, I mean, everybody in government has to bear responsibility for failing to ask the right questions at the right time, and so forth. But our job now is, as I believe that we're doing with tremendous focus on unemployment, is to do everything possible to get people back to work through stabilising not just the banks, but also promote the kind of confidence that means businesses will be prepared to invest. But Vince Cable is absolutely right. We have to have a different kind of banking system, more transparent, less fixed on the short term as a result of this crisis, and never go back to the situation that has made everybody so vulnerable as a result of decisions that were not fully understood.
The idea that you couldn't foresee anything is quite wrong. It was apparent to everybody. There was a credit bubble, there was a house price bubble. Credit was easily available. Not only did the government...
Were you lecturing
I
about
was,
this?
Vince was, I was.
Who was first in?
I have no idea. There were other people more sage than either of us.
I don't remember the Conservative Party saying this. In fact, they were apologising today for saying they hadn't said anything.
We actually did point out, we went on about the public debt, the household debt. Certainly, every budget debate, Vince and I used to compete in saying these things. Yeah. But what we should have is a banking system that's regulated. The idea you go to a government bank, I don't think the government would have made a better job of running the banking system than the bankers, frankly. I think Gordon Brown's as responsible as Fred Goodwin, who we got here. He took credit for the credit boom, did Gordon Brown, wouldn't listen to critics. What you want is a regulatory system which works, which we're now looking at. Gordon Brown set up a new regulatory system, took away controls from the Bank of England, and the regulatory system that Gordon Brown set up was useless.
Well, it
did not work,
all right.
and it let all this happen.
Let's not go back over that, because I think that's generally agreed. But Vince Cable, well, I think it is. But
Tessa agree.
I think she does. Changing the system. They wouldn't be changing the system if she didn't agree.
When you were Chancellor, there was no regulatory system. And secondly, self-regulation and so forth. And secondly, you know perfectly well that since 2000, globalisation has changed in a fundamental way the way in which money moves around.
Vince Cable, just a question to you. Let's look ahead for a minute. Do you think Britain is going to have a worse recession than any other country?
Well, I fear it may well do, and one of the main reasons for that is that we just happen to have some of the largest banks in the world, and they've failed. I mean, the Financial Services Authority that supervises the banking system in a building near here was responsible for 10 banks, and 5 of them have crashed, and the problem is the British taxpayer ultimately liable for that. But I don't want to just continue the historical seminar. We have to look forward. That gentleman in green asked a very good question. How do you devise a system that gets us out of this mess? And I think what we have to focus on is how do we create a system of safe banking that individuals can use, people in the high street, put their money in, keep it safe, lend it out to businesses, and separate that out from the incredibly complicated and dangerous casino operations, which is what the Bank of England governor called them, which are perpetuated in some of these very large banks. And frankly, the government and also Lord Turner, who produced this report yesterday, have completely bottled out of that question. Because it does involve tough questions. It involves telling the very highly paid investment bankers that they can't continue to rely on the taxpayer. And the banks have to be fundamentally restructured to be made safe in a way that they haven't been hitherto.
Okay. We mustn't stay on the economy all evening, tempting though it is, given where we are. The man in red there, I'll take 2 or 3 points from the audience, then we'll go on.
Ms. Giles just admitted that the government has failed to ask the right questions. Having failed to ask the right questions, how can they now be the people to find the answers? Why shouldn't we trust Mr. Clarke, who restored the public finances after the boom of the Lawson years, or Mr. Cable, who's proved to be right time and time again?
Okay, I'll take that as a rhetorical question. I won't ask Ms. Giles to answer it. But the woman there, in the third row from the back. Yes.
We've spent a lot of money on fixing the banking system, but this week's hospital reports, for example, show that there's a tragic loss of life due to failures within public services. What about spending some of this money that hopefully we will get back on public services?
Okay, and the woman over there in red.
Yeah.